Hi, I'm Gavin from the Luthier's Lair, also known as Gavmaster. I'm here with my son Josh, who's doing the camera operation, also known as Slime 4. What we're going to do is we're going to have a look at this older body that I picked up from one of these local stores, because my good friend Dingo Base, also known as Phil, is busy building me a baritone neck. So while we wait for the baritone neck to arrive, we start working on the body. This is a one-piece older body, a Telecaster shape, and one of the things that you'll notice immediately when you're working with a new guitar body is that the surface will be pretty rough. So this has been machined and it's been delivered. There's been a few little add-ons that they've done. So on this particular body, the pickups are already routed out, as is a control panel. And very kindly, the chaps have actually also drilled the ferrule holes so that those are all nice and neat straight off the bat. And great that that's done, because that's something you'd want to do before you actually start painting the guitar, and certainly before you start sanding it. Now, on the front, if Joshua zooms in a bit, you can see that where my fingers are, there's a lot of rough spots over here. And effectively, these need to be sanded out. So the trick here is to use 120. 120 will give you a fairly smooth sort of situation. But what you've got to notice, and I've actually already done the back of the guitar, which I'll flick around, this is already done with 120. Now, if you have a look, the sort of wood particles, etc., from the sanding have actually filled up a lot of the holes over here, that the roughness in the guitar body itself. But if I was to get my compressor out and basically blow on that, these holes would immediately reappear. But as long as it's fairly smooth to the touch, that would then allow you to move on to the 180 grit, 220 if you only have 220, then on to 320 and on to 400 before finally applying the paint. So the trick that we have here is you need a sanding block. What I'm using here is a StewMac adhesive variety. As you can see, it's 120. This sanding block already I've used to sand the back on this side, and then change it to a fresh piece for sanding the top. So this is the 120. The key issue, again, when you are sanding, is to make sure that you sand with the grain. So again, looking at the top, you can see which way the grain's actually flowing. So you don't want to sand that way, because that's going to end up creating a lot more scratches than you had in the first place. So you're going to actually sand with the grain. It's okay to move back and forwards on the grain. You can sand either in that direction, but there's no harm with you sanding backwards and forwards as I'm doing here. Try and resist the temptation to drag the sandpaper across, because the part that you've just freshly sanded will then have the scratch marks as you've actually gone across the grain. So attempt to keep yourself going in the direction of the grain as I'm doing here, and that should end up with a really, really nice finish at 120 before you move on from there to the much finer grain of 220 and then 320 and finally 400. So we've now finished with the 120, and I've taken up a new block, and now we're using 220. Also the adhesive type, and also a nice little flat block. The 120 now complete, and if you zoom in and have a look here, you'll see that there's a big difference in what this now looks like. And you can run your hand over it and you can feel immediately that there's a major improvement. Now, I mentioned a while ago, when you have a look at the back, and you've done the back on this particular guitar, a lot of the wood fibers had actually made their way into these little cracks over here. I did get the compressor out and gave it a spray, and immediately you can see that there's little minor holes that have moved up. And I'd encourage you to try and blow it away, or do something of that nature, so that when you start working with the 220, you can actually see what's there, and all the other little wood fibers are out the way. So with that in mind, we're going to now start going with the 220, and we'll see you just now when it's time for the 320. Just one other thing to bear in mind when you are sanding: if there is any craters or any scratch marks that are on the guitar, working through from 120 through to 400 it's not going to make those scratches disappear. Effectively, you've got to make those scratches disappear with the 120. If there are little grooves and scratches afterwards, those are really the scratches that have been made by the 120 grit sandpaper. So moving up the line through to the 220, you're actually really trying to get rid of the scratches that you made with the 120. By moving on to 320, you're trying to get rid of the scratches that you made with the 220, so the scratches are a lot smaller. And then moving on to the 400, the only scratches that you're going to have on the guitar at that point in time are those made by the 400. We'll then use a 0000 steel wool to get rid of those final scratches and polishing up the guitar before we work on painting it. So just remember that if there are any marks, scratches or anything of that nature on the guitar, by working through the grits, you're not going to make a big scratch disappear by working through with 400. The only way you're going to get it is by getting those scratches out right at the start with the 120. And if the scratches actually require you to use 80, then that's obviously a consideration that you may have to bear in mind. What I'm going to do now is just show you what you need to do with the sides. One of the things they teach you when you are writing binding and you're putting binding on with the router is to know the direction of the grain of the wood, because if you go against the grain, you're likely to get something called chip out, which will damage the guitar. Now, quite simply, one of the things that you need to look at is the various halfway points of where the actual waist is. So if you took the pinnacle point of the waist being there and you go in that direction, you'll find that that's more or less the right way. You can actually feel it. So if you rub your hand along it, you can feel the way the grain is and the direction that the grain is going. But what's interesting is that when you go to this side here, you'll find that the grain is actually going this way rather than that way. And again, you can feel it. So when you actually do this next procedure, you actually want to sand with the grain only in one direction. Going back the other way, it's going to kind of rip up the fibers and leave your finish looking rough regardless. So what I've done now is I've taken a piece of 120, I've cut it in half with a pair of scissors, and what we're going to do now is show you how to sand this part. Now, very easy. We're going to place our sandpaper onto the guitar, and this is a bit sticky, so I've got to be a little bit careful, and then you basically drag this through like that and do that a number of times, and that should give us a nice finish with the 120. Right, so as you can see, I'm making sure that I go around about the halfway mark where we would typically place the strap holder, and then I flip the guitar the other way, and again I go through the process, and I'm moving down towards the halfway mark. I don't want to go further than that because otherwise I'm going against the grain of what I've actually already created there. So over here it's nice and smooth. On the edges here, again, looking really nice and smooth. But what we need to consider is once we get to this part here. So again, looking at the pinnacle point, which would be there, you're going to take the sandpaper and you're going to go down towards the waist. On this side over here, you're going to be going in that direction to make sure that you get this nice and smooth. Again, just feel it and you'll know immediately which is the correct way to go. Over here, on this side, this is actually quite smooth actually. It's been machined quite nicely. But again, here, feel which way it's going, and you can see here it's going in that direction. Over here, it'll be going in the direction down towards this area, which would be the waist sort of side on this here. So keep that in mind when you're going ahead, and you should end up with a really nice finish. Over here, what we're going to do is put our sandpaper down. We're going towards the waist from the top. This is from there, that section's there, and then from this section going that way, we're actually going to be going up towards the horn. So now, just from a time perspective, with the 120, probably 10 minutes this side, 10 minutes that side with the 120. Once you got into the 220, probably half that time, so probably only about 5 minutes aside. And then similar situation, it's probably going to take you a good 10 to 15 minutes with the 120 to get this looking really nice and smooth, maybe as much as 20 minutes. And then working with the 220, you'll probably find it'll only take you about 10 minutes to get a good job.